And welcome to another edition of NMG's podcast series. We're joined by Peter Jarich. He's Chief Analyst of Global Telecom and IT at GlobalData. And Peter, welcome to the program.
Great to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us. And just for our audience, as a reminder, NMG's podcast series typically starts with a presentation that walks us through a specific area. In this case, it's 5G. And then we open the podcast to our audience who will have some questions for Peter in just a bit. So, Peter, you are at the Comtech Forum on Network Transformation for 5G. That's an event in Santa Clara. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, and you just gave a presentation called 5G, the Coming Business Transformation, and Why It's Not About 5G. I wanted to get your sentiment on the general idea behind why it's not about 5G, and I do understand you have the presentation as well.
Yeah, so I think that a lot of what we've talked about in terms of 5G, a lot about the opportunity, right? The promise of 5G. There's two sort of things that I think are oftentimes missed in the conversation around it. One is that the business models and the business changes that are implied require more than just business change, right, or the network change, right? That we can have a completely new network, different networks, but we need to be thinking about the business relations and how we look at the business of communications to really make them work. And second is that a lot of these technologies, the use cases that we talk about for 5G are already being executed on now. And so we don't really need to wait for 5G. And that's really the shorthand.
Peter, if you could just walk us through your presentation, and I believe our listeners can actually view this through the BrightTALK platform as well. If you can just walk us through that.
Great. Yeah, no, definitely. And of course, if anyone's seeing it and want to copy the slides, feel free to reach out to me. Be glad to share them. The basic idea of what I want to talk about here is sort of thinking about 5G in two ways. One, sort of the things that we know, and sort of things that we are less certain, things that we don't necessarily know, and a bit about summing up what it all means. And I start with this idea of what we know because I think for those of us who have been following 5G for a while, there was a period of lots of questions, right? What will the new air interface look like? Will there be a new air interface? What's going to be required in the core? Why do we need 5G? And so we're in a much better position now where I think we understand 5G, but there's still a lot of questions that are out there that are definitely worth thinking about if we want to make 5G everything that people think it will be. So I think the main thing, and I remember a number of years ago there were the questions of what are we going to use 5G for? What's it all about? I think now we understand what those use cases are, and this is a diagram. There's one of many that are out there in terms of thinking about how to position it. But breaking it up into enhanced mobile broadband, mission-critical communications. Think about that in terms of low latency, and then of course massive IoT or massive machine-type communications. And you can break that down into different use cases within those and what's required. But we're at a point now where at least we understand. Look, those are going to be the main focal points of 5G. We also know, and I think this has been an ongoing question of when it's coming. And we can think about them from a standards perspective. I can go out and I could throw a slide on here or a chart on here that shows how the standards are progressing and when we'll see standards development. But I think we all know that probably more important than standards development is probably the commercial side of things. And that's just an example of some of what's driving the timing around 5G, right? Special events, right? Whether it's the World Cup, whether it's the Winter Olympics coming up in 2018 next year, whether it's the Tokyo Olympics, all of these events have sort of conspired along with folks like AT&T and Verizon who want to move quickly to drive the timing, to drive the agenda for when we're going to be seeing deployments of it. It used to be positioned as a 2020 technology. Now it's positioned as a 2019 technology with 2018 seeing initial deployments. All of that's being driven not necessarily by the standards, but the standards following or trying to keep up with, the rest of the market. But at least we sort of know what that time frame looks like now, much more than we might have, in the past. And of course, from a subscriber standpoint, we know not necessarily exactly how big it's going to be because no forecast is ever perfect, but This is our own numbers looking at, the number of connections up through 2022, getting to, close to that 500,000 mark, almost 450 in just a few years. There's a million. Expectations vary of will it be faster uptake than LTE or slower, but we know it's not just sort of a niche thing or a questionable thing. We know that by all accounts, operators around the world are committed to it, and we're going to see deployments that will ramp up, fairly quickly. So, those are kind of the things that we know. Because the questions of what we don't know, I think, are the more interesting ones that I want to talk about for the next few minutes, right? So, I'm going to start with the assumptions and then maybe question some of those. So there's this assumption that 5G is really a platform for business innovation. This brave new world of relations where we can create new solutions to support digital industries and vertical markets and different enterprise markets. And this is just a slide from some of the work that Huawei is doing with their X Labs. I was recently with them at the Mobile Broadband Forum, and right, it's how do we leverage new network technologies to create these new solutions. And it's a great story for 5G, but for those of us who were around to see WiMAX and some of the technologies that preceded 5G, we heard that story before, right? That was the WiMAX story. WiMAX was going to be all about new business innovation, leveraging new technologies that were open, that were inexpensive to enable new solutions in new industries. And I remember one story that came out from, at the time it was the CTO of Sprint, who was a big WiMAX promoter, talking about this idea that he was on vacation in Turkey with his wife, and he was in the Grand Plaza, and there was this busload of Chinese tourists, and wouldn't it be great if there was a WiMAX network there, that as the Chinese tourists arrived, the WiMAX network could tell the digital signage that there was a great Chinese restaurant down the street, and someone could monetize that, right? The operator could get their share, and that's the kind of thing that WiMAX was going to enable. And it was great until you brought up that you wouldn't need a WiMAX network for it. Right, you could do that with 2G. A 2G network would know that they were from another country just as well as a WiMAX network. It was the business side of things that was the harder part. Yeah, we could be doing that today if someone wanted to. We're not. Why? Because it's the business side more than the network side of things that becomes the sticking point. The other thing we hear a lot is that 5G is going to be an opportunity to drive core renovation, right? Here's the chart from SK Telecom showing sort of all the things that we can think about around 5G, whether it's edge clouds, whether it's a renovation of the core in terms of cloud-native technologies, whether it's change in terms of what we're going to do on the OSS, BSS, really leveraging 5G to rethink what we're doing in the network. And that's great. But the reality is we're already seeing that without 5G, right? You look at the work that's going on with Cord, and when Cord's getting a lot of attention, and Cord being the central office re-architect of the data center, right, pushing edge computing. And a lot of folks saw that as, let's say, AT&T driving that early on, but now you see interest everywhere, right? The idea of re-architecting the network, thinking about new topologies. You see the interest in ONAP, ONAP being really the work that took place from the OpenO initiative around NFV orchestration and management out of China predominantly, with the eComp work from AT&T. You've got a lot of operators on board. What's the point? They're all interested in how to think about implementing and managing virtualization within their networks. The idea about changing the core, about renovating the core, is a good one around 5G, and it's going to take place in the context of 5G, but it's going to take place before that. Right, and one of the big things we do here at GlobalData on my team is we look at competitive positioning and how vendors are positioning their solutions. And when we looked at what's taking place with the cloud native, right, you see this is taking place right now, right? The vendors all have different stories in terms of what they think cloud native means, how quickly it comes around, where you need to apply it, but they all have a cloud native story. And why is that? It's because operators are looking at it now, yes, recognizing its importance for 5G, but looking at it now and how it applies to their network today, not waiting for 5G. One of the other things you hear about IoT, and I think you hear this one most often, is that it's all about connected devices. And I think the opposite is when I hear the opposite, I think that's probably even more interesting, is when someone says, 5G is it's not all about connected devices. And when someone has to sort of come at that position of, well, it's not just about connected devices, that there's a presumption that it's mostly about connected devices, right? This idea that if we can drive down the costs, if we can make it cheap enough that we're going to be connecting everything. And that cheap enough part is important, because the reality is we could connect everything today, right? I mean, we could connect a 2G, 3G, or LTE radio to everything today. It's possible. The networks might have a little bit of a hard time with it, but we could scale the networks to support it. We could connect those modules. It just wouldn't be cost effective, right? It's not the idea of adding an LTE radio to lots of low value assets probably just doesn't make sense. The idea is that 5G can change that, and it's going to change those dynamics. The problem here is, if we think about 5G just being about IoT, and that IoT is only going to scale with 5G, that's a problem, because it ignores a lot of what's going on, right? It ignores what's taking place on the cellular front with LTE-M, with NB-IoT, with the proprietary LP-WAN stories, with Sigfox and Lauren Ingenue, and even the innovation that's taking place, right? There's just an analysis that one of my analysts wrote up just a couple of weeks ago about, about Senate. Senate was innovating on top of some of the work that Laura has done by developing basically a virtual network, right? A virtual network that can support global connectivity. So yes, 5G is going to really help with this idea of allowing networks to scale to support new numbers of devices that we can't now. And yes, it will help to enable cheap connectivity when we get to, let's say, narrowband 5G. But even taking away from the idea that the standards, the first initial standards of 5G aren't going to be focused on the IoT use cases, the reality is those price points that we're talking about are already being targeted with LTE. They're already being targeted with today's networks, as well as proprietary ones. Slicing is another one of the technologies that gets brought up a lot around 5G. And Ericsson deserves a lot of credit for coining the term, but the idea being that we can leverage one physical network to create a bunch of logical networks that meet different use cases, different requirements, performance requirements of them, right? And 5G is seen as one of the places where we'll start to implement that. The reality, though, is it's not really a new capability, right? It's taking place now, right? We have prioritization on networks, whether that's prioritization in terms of QCI codes, whether it's prioritization in terms of prioritization that we're going to see for public safety. And it's a very, it's not just sort of a theoretical thing that might be put into place. When you see the unlimited plans being rolled out by the folks like T-Mobile, like AT&T, like Verizon, a lot of those unlimited plans, when you look at the different tiers, those tiers include prioritization, right? The expectation that when you hit a certain amount of data usage, you'll be deprioritized. Or if you're buying the cheaper package, you'll be deprioritized. Or you'll be limited to a certain data rate, right? This is taking place in the here and now. So it's a neat capability, but it's been around. And so the question is, how do we actually get it to be used, and how do we think about its usage and driving it further? Last, before I sort of get to the roundup, is the sort of idea that 5G is going to be a platform for spectrum innovation. And you definitely see this, right? When you look at the demos, right? You definitely see this idea, particularly around millimeter wave spectrum. This idea, you had Samsung working with KDDI around 5G mobility tests, right? Looking at how do we have handoff? How do we have mobility at millimeter wave spectrum? You see the work that the vendors are doing in terms of massive MIMO and beamforming, right? We're talking about 64 by 64 antenna arrays or 120 antenna arrays, right? That are not something that requires the size of an entire building, but we put on a tower, right? If you were to ask people just years ago, that this would be mind-boggling, right? The idea of supporting mobility at millimeter wave spectrum is just they would have said impossible. Laws of physics don't allow it. So we are seeing 5G driving some real innovation on this front. But that can't obscure the fact that we're seeing innovation without 5G, whether that's what's taking place in unlicensed spectrum, the work around LAA, and we're seeing that get rolled out, whether that's around spectrum sharing like the CBRS bands, and that's this second diagram here on the right of the slide. We're seeing innovation take place regardless of 5G on the spectrum front. And that's important, right? So spectrum is one of the most high-valued, important assets in wireless, right? It's the lifeblood. And so there's always going to be a drive to find better usage, more efficiency for it. So it's not surprising, but it's worth a reminder that, yes, 5G is about spectrum innovation, but we're seeing that without 5G as well. And so, if you think about the so what of all of this, I think there's a couple takeaways, right? Undeniably, the 5G opportunity is going to be massive, right? You can believe our numbers, you can believe numbers from other folks, whoever you want. I think we all recognize that it's not just sort of a maybe thing, but there is a huge opportunity that's out there. And it is going to require some major network evolutions, whether it's in the radio access network or the core or whatever. We really are looking at this as an opportunity. Operators are looking at this, vendors are looking at this as an opportunity to rethink networks, upgrade networks, evolve and renovate them. At the same time, though, the business evolutions that are going to be required to actually leverage those networks, to find new constituencies for services, to roll out new solutions, may be more challenging, right? Those are going to be what's important to actually make money off those networks. Those are going to be challenging. But the good thing is we can begin planning for 5G and begin planning for executing on those evolutions today, given what we see in network capabilities with LTE, that we don't have to wait for 5G. In fact, we can't wait for 5G if we actually want to execute on those. So that was it in a nutshell. And again, if anyone out there wants to copy these slides, please feel free to reach out to me. But yeah, hopefully that made sense.
Absolutely, Peter. I wanted to go back just a bit on the network slicing and spectrum innovation part of your presentation. I have a couple questions in both areas, and in fact, there's a couple of audience questions that came in to the same effect. So let me see if I can sort this out as we're talking here. But what's an example of how, and just walk me through this, what's an example of how network slicing can on one hand support, let's say, an IoT device or IoT devices versus maybe a high data throughput virtual reality application?
Yeah, I mean, so the idea there being, so for, let's think about how slicing fits into an IoT, low latency IoT application versus something that says high bandwidth, right? So the idea being, let's give the example of a, connected car or something where, it requires low latency. From a network slicing perspective, I guess the way it would work, or at least in theory, would be given the requirements for low latency, but not necessarily high bandwidth, maybe it can connect on either, maybe it connects on a non-5G network that has less contention, or maybe it connects on a 5G network, but it connects via an edge node that's closer to the user, so the latency is lower. But it connects to assets that allow the latency to be higher versus, let's say, something that may be less latency intensive but requires high bandwidth. And then maybe it can connect to a different node where, let's say, maybe there's either higher capacity backhaul or there's less contention but it's further away. I think that's the idea of how slicing would work. It is lining up the right resources for the requirements. And yes, you'll even have things where it might be a low latency, high throughput application. Maybe we're talking about real-time AR or VR where you require all of the above. Then it has to figure out how it connects to that and how it actually, again, that's the value prop really of slicing. Ultimately, it's this idea that we can't even think about what all those different use cases are. We need to create the capabilities to allow the resources for each of those use cases to actually be served up.
So yeah, thank you, Peter. The next question I had before we get to a couple of audience questions is around the spectrum of innovation portion of your presentation. So how are 3GPP standards working to establish this new 5G radio specification? How is that coming along from your vantage point? And is industry field testing 5G trials in accordance with those standards? How is there a seamless confluence between those two areas of focus, or is it a little more friction between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I think that we are seeing the industry work with the status bodies pretty well.
Hey, Peter, I don't mean to interrupt. Are you on speakerphone?
I am not. I am traveling, so there might be a little contention here. Is that better?
Yes. We're losing. That's a little better, yeah.
Okay. Hold on. You know what? Let me see if I can. Let me see if I can make it even one better here. Hold on. How is this? Is this better?
That's 100 times better, yeah.
There we go. So yeah, so I think we're seeing the market work. I think it's working out pretty well, and I say that because well, let's just take the example of what took place with standards formation, right? Where there was a standards timeline, and then we saw particular operators who wanted to see that timeline accelerated, and we saw the operators come together to make an argument for that, and the 3GPP and the industry responded. Now, there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs that go along with that, right? With the idea that by accelerating the standards, certain aspects are going to have to be deprioritized, right? So we can't do everything and get it all done quicker, right? The idea of doing more and doing it all faster is just, it just doesn't work out. But I think it's a good example of how it's worked out well, right? How we've seen that coming together. And then the vendors getting behind it, right? And there's a lot of fighting behind the scenes. It's not easy, but yeah, I think we've definitely, I would say it's been an example of how the industry can work together, but it's also been a recognition of how important this is, right? It's been a recognition of this is something that there's a lot of stakeholders that really want to see some success here, and so I think it's a good example of the industry working together, but also recognizing the importance of all this.
Peter, I want to get to a couple of our audience questions before we go. We have a few minutes. First question is this, and again, it's on spectrum innovation. Are 5G new radio standards designed to operate across different spectrum types, that from licensed spectrum and then to unlicensed and shared spectrum?
Yeah, so that is the hope, right? So in terms of, a lot of what you see in terms of the R&D and innovation going into NR, the new radio, the standard. A lot of what you see about the innovation going into it is that the design has been there so that it can support multiple different spectrum bands, right? So we're talking about below 10 gigahertz and above 10 gigahertz, and ultimately into unlicensed and whatnot. Now, are those the first applications? No, right? Are the first application is going to be something where you'll see it unlicensed? No, and I think that in part it's because it's got to start somewhere. In part it's because you've seen so much effort around when we think about pushing cellular standards into unlicensed. There's been so much work around things like LAA for LTE, right? And so there's already a lot of work going pushing LTE into those, but will we see NR in those? Of course, right? It's only a matter of time. On the shared spectrum side, I've called this out a number of times. I'm not the only one. That where we see the most movement on shared spectrum is obviously here in the U.S. with CBRS and 3.5 band. In other parts of the world, the 3.5 band looks to be pretty much expected to be a 5G band, right? There's a lot of other countries that are setting aside for 5G. So for shared spectrum, yeah, we're going to see the first shared spectrum stuff here in the U.S., at least around LTE and CBRS. There's nothing stopping it from going to 5G when it's available, but the industry wanted to move quick, and if the industry wanted to move quick, LTE was really the only option. But yes, you should be able to see NR go into all of those, if not right away, at some point.
Peter, I want to get to one more audience question before we go, and I do appreciate you hanging in there with us. Are vendors and mobile operators already cooperating in the development of 5G network slicing?
That's a great question. So I think on the one hand, you can look to things like all the trials and the demos that take place, right? There was no shortage last year of demos at Mobile World Congress focused on slicing. I think we'll probably see more. Some operators seem to be more interested in it than others, but that's just natural. On the other hand, the thing that I would say that's a good indication
as you look at some of the work that's taking place out of things like the GSMA, right, where the GSMA is working with operators to help form templates, right, templates for, some slicing templates for what are a few basic examples, right, because we can think about this, right, and I mentioned before, one of the great things about slicing is that, you could think about millions and millions of permutations of different capabilities and requirements based on, every single use case, but spinning those up and preparing those is obviously going to be untenable if we're talking about not knowing where to start in millions and millions. So, just the idea, I think, of having a body like the GSMA work on those templates, work with operators to understand their requirements, work to understand what's required there, and then help to make sure that the vendors can be ready. I think that's another good example. That said, more important than vendors working with operators, what I think is needed, and I think we need to see more of, is the operators and the vendors working with enterprises, right? Working with digital industries, with vertical markets to understand their needs. Because that's been one of the big stories, right? The big story of 5G is, more than anything, more than just AR and VR and whatnot, that things like massive IoT and things like splicing are going to be important for helping operators target new constituencies, target the needs of these vertical markets. And that's a great story so that they can, grow their revenues, but it doesn't make sense unless they're engaging with them. So I do think there's been a good amount of engagement between vendors and operators to understand things like slicing. I think we need to pull in more of those vertical industries to make sure that we're actually aligning it with, with where we think it needs to go.
Well, Peter, we appreciate you offering your presentation. Again, it was called 5G, the Coming Business Transformation, and Why It's Not About 5G. For any of you out there listening who don't have direct access to this presentation, you can certainly contact us through the networkmediagroup.com, and we'll be happy to forward that presentation to you. Peter, I know you're at the Comtech Forum. You're probably running from one room to the other, so we appreciate you giving us your time.
No, thank you guys. I appreciate it.
All right, we'll talk soon.
Take care, everyone.